Today, we are going to talk about an unsolved murder that happened in Germany involving an entire family. There's a lot of strange elements to this case and a ton of interesting theories to go along with it.
Hi, welcome to True Creeps,
Where the stories are true,
and the creeps are real,
we'll cover stories from grotesque gore
to the possibly plausible paranormal,
to horrifying history
to tense and terrible true crime.
and everything else that goes bump in the night. We're your hosts, Amanda.
And I'm Lindsay, and we want you to join us while we creep.
We cover mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to be talking about an unsolved murder that happened in Germany involving an entire family. This case has a lot of strange elements and some interesting similarities to our very first episode, the Villisca Axe murders. Now, I just want to say a quick warning. This case does involve sexual assault, as well as some brutal details about the murders, so just be aware. And then additionally, some of the sources of this case were in German, so we had to translate them. Unfortunately, I don't speak German. I wish I did. But like most translations, some information can get skewed a bit, and that likely leads to a little bit of varying information here and there. If it seems like something didn't really match a lot of the sources or like something stood out, we'll try to point it out. And then also, because it's an older case, some of the initial evidence and reports from the actual crime scene and everything, they were lost due to age and also because of World War II.
Yeah. Also, while we're just giving our caveats in the beginning,
yeah,
my 13-year-old Pit is recovering from surgery as we record this. So if you hear her tip-tapping around the room or you hear any dog sounds, I always give it even when she's fine, but she gets extra grace today because she's recovering from surgery and she's in the cutest pajamas.
She really is. Like, I just kind of want to watch her sleep instead of record.
Fair. She is very cute. She knows it. She's gotten so many treats.
She better get her cat food.
She needs it.
Okay, so first, let's talk about where the family lived and who they were. The family lived in a remote farmstead known today as Hinterkaifeck. It was built around 1863, and it was located about 43 miles north of Munich. The farm was surrounded by dense woods, and it was pretty isolated. And just to describe the farm a little bit, from some of the pictures that we could see and some diagrams, it looks like it had a living quarters, a stable, and a barn. But it seems like all of them were kind of under the same roof, but separated by walls and doors. And there was an attic upstairs, this is important to know, that was open, and it could be accessed by a ladder, either from the living quarters or from the barn.
Interesting.
Now let's talk about the family themselves. They consisted of Andreas Gruber, who was 63. He worked as a farmhand until he married his wife, Cecilia Assam. And they got married on April 14th of 1886 after her husband passed away from pneumonia. And so she was actually already living on the farm. It was her farm. Her husband passed away. And then that's how Andreas got into the picture, is after her husband passed away, he got married and then kind of took over the farm. He wasn't a good man, and he was known to have a temper. In some reports, he was feared by his wife's family, and he was very abusive towards his employees, and honestly everyone, it seemed. From a lot of gossip, the neighbors despised him. And there's also more reasons to show why he was a terrible human, and we're going to get to those shortly.
Cecilia moved to Hinterkaifeck after she married Joseph Assam von Hinterkaifeck. Once he died, she needed someone that could help her with the farm, and presumably she wanted a husband, so she married Andreas. She did have another child or children, but there are various conflicting sources on what happened to those children. When we say conflicting, what we mean is that there's like a zillion different stories. So some say the children died early, if there were multiple, while other sources say that at least one grew into adulthood, a man who was not present at the time of the murders because he had moved away at that time. And yet another source says that he may have died a few years before the murders. Cecilia had 3 children with Andreas, but only one survived into adulthood, and that's Victoria. She grew up on the farm, and in 1914, when she was 27, she married Carl Gabriel, a farmer's son. And once she married Carl, then Hinterkaifeck was transferred to her because Cecilia owned it, which I think is interesting because you don't often hear of women property owners in that time period. And I love that.
Yeah, and that fact also kind of varied a little bit. Some say it was like right before she got married, and some say like right after the marriage, but at some point it was transferred to her.
Yeah. So 9 months later, Carl and Victoria's baby was born, and she was named after Victoria's mother, so they named her Cecilia Gabriel. We're not going to say Big Cecilia, Little Cecilia. We're going to say Celie for Little Cecilia. So to note, Carl moved to Hinterkaifeck after the couple got married, but he fled back home a few months later, back to his parents. And compared to Victoria's family, Carl's family wasn't that well off. And so his family insisted that he return to his wife. Instead, Carl joined the German army during World War I. And it's unclear whether he voluntarily joined or was drafted into the German army. But either way, he was in the German army during World War I and died in combat in France in December of 1914. He ultimately ended up passing about a month before Cecilia was born. Oof.
That's sad.
So Amanda mentioned this earlier, but a sexual assault warning. We mentioned Andreas. He fucking sucked earlier, but he was known to sexually assault his daughter, Victoria. And from what we can see, it may have started when she was a teenager. And there were witnesses to some of the assaults over the year.
Witnesses, plural, multiple people.
Over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this in other cases before, but there's this common misconception that a person who hurts children does not hurt adults. People have believed that about sexual predators and serial killers and people just who harm people generally for decades. And it is simply not true. Studies done within the past decade show that that is categorically not true. That somebody who hurts children can hurt adults and vice versa. Just to say, like, she was a child and it continued on.
Mm-hmm.
So there is one horrific story that we saw that said Victoria was around 17 when it started. She'd become ill and a doctor advised her to be intimate with a man. And since there was not a suitor for her, Andreas took her virginity in the presence of Cecilia. Now, we only saw this story in one source, but what a fucking horror show.
Yeah.
We know that there's a time period where doctors were prescribing orgasms for women for various medical illnesses, including hysteria. There were times when doctors were doing that themselves. So I don't find it completely implausible that an orgasm would be perhaps prescribed. But I do think that it would be strange to counsel an unmarried woman to have sex prior to marriage, especially at that age, especially if we're talking about the early 1900s. That seems like perhaps that was an excuse, in my opinion, but
he's a creep. So she also told their neighbor's wife at the time that she had been abused by her father. And at this time, unfortunately, it wasn't looked at as we look at it today as just abuse. They looked at it as incest and faulted her at it as well, which breaks my heart for her.
Yeah, I mean, even today, there are people who look at young women who are legally, technically, realistically children, and they go, oh, well, she looks older. Or, oh, she shouldn't have worn that. Like, people still do that today.
Mm-hmm.
Disgusting,
mm-hmm.
though.
Yeah, awful. And just because we're going to talk about them further, I want to discuss those neighbors a little bit. And the neighbors was the Schlittenbauer family. And in 1899, Lorenz Schlittenbauer took over his parents' farm, which was located about a third of a mile away. He lived there with his wife, also named Victoria, before she died, and she died in 1918. Also to note, shortly after little Cecilia, who, again, we're going to call Celie, just so we can differentiate the two. Shortly after she turned 1, Andreas was convicted of immorality and sentenced to a year in prison. Sadly, Victoria was also convicted and sentenced to a month. And the immorality, from what we saw, it seemed like it was what they were deeming incest or sexual abuse, but both of them were convicted for it. Now, even though he spent time behind bars, it did not stop him from continuing the abuse. After her husband died, he forbade Victoria to have a relationship with other men. But she did end up having a relationship with the neighbor, Lorenz, so after his wife died.
Mm-hmm.
So they did have a brief relationship. And at some point, for some reason, he brings it up. And it could be, there's a lot of times he was questioned for various things. But anyways, he claims that he was with her 5 times. And one of them being weeks after his wife passed away. Victoria became pregnant with her son, Joseph, who was born on September 7th of 1919. It is truly unknown who the father was of this baby because Andreas was still abusing her at the time.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking. In so many situations where a woman is being abused and being victimized, she is in a position where she has nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that here Victoria is, and she is the owner of this farm. This is her property that this is happening on, and she still feels that helpless.
Yep.
That is how truly awful he must have been.
Yeah. Everything that I saw on him was just, I didn't see any good stuff. Like, he just seems like he was mean and horrible to his family, to the employees, just not a great person. Now, interestingly, the birth certificate does show Lawrence as the father, but he always had his doubts. So there was some fighting over that as well, because obviously what Andreas was doing was frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some debates, and I saw some cases where he had to pay child support at one point as well. So he wasn't too happy about that because it seems like he always had his doubts.
Yeah, I could also see that for the sake of the child, not wanting that child to be associated with Andres generally, but also because it would follow them their entire life.
It would, especially in a smaller community. Now, at this time as well, being pregnant and unmarried was not good. And the neighbors gossiped and talked and kind of shunned them because they were thought of as deviants and outcasts for a number of reasons. So just not just her having a baby unmarried, but also for what Andreas was doing.
Yeah, of course.
And some sources also say that Lawrence wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas refused and was like, no, you can't. After Joseph was born, Lawrence testified against Andreas on September 10th of 1919. And again, that's only a few days after the baby was born.
Yeah.
Andreas was imprisoned for incest from September 13th to September 27th. Victoria, luckily, didn't do time, though instead begged Lawrence to withdraw his statements. He agreed, and that's why Andreas was released so quick. Victoria ended up just ending her relationship with Lawrence, and eventually he remarried. So he remarried, had his own family, still a neighbor.
And I could see why she would be like, it's going to be worse.
Yeah, I feel like she lost either way, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So let's get back to who was living at the farm when the murders happened.
So we're moving forward in time because at this point, Victoria's children, Celie, are 7, and then Joseph is about 2.5. And so they're living there as well as Victoria, Cecilia, and Andreas. There's also Maria Baumgartner, who was 44 or 45, and she had just arrived at the farm hours before the murders took place. Now, she had been hired to work there as a maid and was supposed to start the following day on April 1st of 1922. Some sources say that she was starting the day of her arrival, which was Friday, March 31st of 2022. She was replacing a previous maid, and we'll talk about her in a bit. According to Maria's sister, Franziska Schaefer, Maria had mental and physical disabilities. She walked with a limp because one leg was shorter than the other, and she had worked as a maid for an old woman, but she was let go because the mayor did not like that there was a person with a physical disability in town, which is disgusting. And when we're talking about like that type of mentality, unfortunately, that was very common, that people saw your physical health as such a representation of your morality and your spiritual health as well. They saw them as tied, so that if you had a visible disability, it was treated as though there was something that you did that made you have that. So Franziska walked Maria to Hinterkaifeck farm the day that she had moved in, and then Franziska walked to her own home, which was not obviously right there.
Yeah.
So now leading up to the murders, we mentioned a moment ago that there was a previous maid, and that was Kristen Reiger, and she had worked as a maid for the Grubers from November of 1920 to September of 1921. She had a daughter in March of 1921, and the father, Jacob Weber, died in the hospital on May 21st during an operation. Because Jacob and Crescence were unmarried, Crescence had limited income, and her child's father was dead, so the child was put into foster care and later adopted. So one of the widely discussed reasons for Crescence leaving her job is because of what she said during a statement in 1952.
So that happened after the murders.
Mm-hmm. So in this statement, she said she discussed hearing noises coming from the attic of the home. Also, that her bedroom door would suddenly open at midnight and she would never see anyone. It would even open when it was locked. This happened almost every day at the same time. So, not too surprisingly, Crescence got scared and she left. Although that would be terrifying, she did give other statements in 1922, 1929, 1931, and 1933 that included other reasons why she may have left. In her 1922 statement, she talked about Carl and Anton Bichler. So Anton worked odd jobs, often around the farm, and Anton, it seemed like he had a crush on Crescence and even proposed to her in November of 1920, shortly after she had started working there. He would often try to come to her window at night to try to quote-unquote woo her. But these late-night window visits turned when she denied his advances. She didn't want to sleep with him. She didn't want a relationship. And the Grubers had advised her to stay away from him as he and his brother were thieves, quote-unquote. So she was being harassed, and this is likely the reason that she left. But there are reasons to believe that something did happen in the attic as well. And we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah. It just seemed like he would not stop.
Yeah. He just wouldn't take no for an answer.
I mean, not being able to sleep, but also having to be the maid would be hard. Like, either way, if it was something spooky happening or someone at your window every fucking night, she was over it.
I would also say that you cannot make me believe that Andreas was only going to hurt Victoria.
I think that too, yeah.
Also, how long could you stay in a place where that was happening if you had no power to stop it?
Mm-hmm. I also did see in one of the sources, it was an opinion article about it, that it was common for people to blame paranormal for leaving the jobs so that they wouldn't have to say the real reasons.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to say, I think the house was haunted, and someone go, oof, than say, I felt uncomfortable around these men.
Now, let's move on to some of the weird happenings before the murders. Sometime in March, Andreas found a newspaper from Munich on the property. He didn't purchase it, nor did anyone in the family. He asked neighbors about it, and they also didn't know where it came from. The theory that everyone was thinking is that the postman must have accidentally dropped it, but when asked, he mentioned that no one in the area subscribed to it. So it's odd that the paper from one of the bigger areas made its way to the farm.
I would also venture to guess that he was probably a scary dude and people wouldn't admit to littering on his farm. I just don't think there's a world where Andreas is going to be like, hey friends, I'm a really chill dude. I'm a reasonable person that you think is going to have a reasonable response to, oops, I dropped something on your property. I wouldn't admit to dropping something on accident. I wouldn't admit to leaving something there. And if I was the postman, I wouldn't tell you who else it could have been, because given how he responded to Victoria perhaps having other types of suitors, say it was somebody who was visiting her.
That's true.
That could have such dire and violent consequences that I too would be like, I'm not telling you shit.
Right.
Not to say that it couldn't be other things.
Now, on March 30th, there were tracks in the snow leading from the forest to the farm's machine room, or I've seen it called an engine room or shed as well. But this area had no access to the stable or the barn that was behind it. Interestingly, the lock on the door was also broken. That same day, we also saw that at one point, it could have been the same day, I've seen it various days, but a set of house keys were missing. The scariest part of this is the footprints never lead away from the farm. There's only footprints to the farm, but not away. So facing the direction of the farm. Now, while out that day, Andreas stops and talks with Lawrence around 11 a.m. And then he runs into another farmer named Casper and tells them about the break-ins and the tracks. So this is known to a few different people that someone or something came to the farm, but never left. On March 31st of 1922, it is believed that the murders took place this night. That morning, Andreas and Victoria went shopping in town. While there, Andreas told the hardware store employee about some weird noises in the attic during the night and how a cow had gotten loose or escaped during the night. Victoria was said to have told others the same stories, but perhaps in another shop. So they're telling people, like, there's some weird stuff happening at the farm. Around 4:30 in the evening, Maria arrives with her sister. Her sister stays for about an hour before leaving. She is likely the last person to see the family alive.
Damn.
Now, we should mention, too, that at some point, Andreas did go up into the attic with a lantern and look around, and he found nothing out of the ordinary. This was from a statement taken 8 years later, There's also mention that Andreas had said that he wasn't afraid and that he had his rifle ready. So it seems like he suspected someone was on the farm or like visiting the farm, but we don't know why.
There is a definable feeling of when someone is in your space and should not be.
Yeah.
There's just that feeling on the back of your neck where you're just like, in my gut, I know. And maybe that's why he was like, this is weird and that's weird. And I was ready for something to happen.
Well, and I think him, and again, this is just speculation, but I think him telling people in town too, well, I'm not afraid, I have my rifle ready, is kind of like a, if you know, or if it's you or whatever, like, I will kill.
Know that I'm going to come prepared.
Yeah, exactly. Just to get the message out, like, I'm prepared for anyone, and hopefully to ward off that. So then on Saturday, April 1st of 1922, Seeley doesn't show up for school. And I thought it was weird because that was a Saturday, but according, to Google, Germany used to have school on Saturdays until around the 50s or 60s, which I thought was interesting because I just didn't consider school on Saturday. Because I was like, this has to be wrong. It must have been that Monday, like a couple days. But the more I looked, it looked like she would have gone to school on Saturdays. Also, that same day, coffee salesmen Hans and Edward Schervosky visited the farm. And that was around 12 and then around 2. But each time that they visited, no one was there. I also love the idea of coffee salesmen coming and giving me coffee.
Yeah. We went full circle for Uber Eats.
We did.
We went from people coming to your home to sell you things to us just having things arrive without salesmen. We sell it to ourselves.
I just imagine the coffee was better.
When you're thinking of the early 1900s, there wasn't a lot of food regulation yet. So there was a lot of weird shit happening in food where there was stuff added that you just wouldn't expect. And I think that when it came to the adulteration of food,
that's happening today too.
It's still happening, but people weren't thinking of it. And whereas now they're like, we found a new chemical that will make you hungry all the time. Right. Then they were like, hey, we've got some ashes. Coffee's bitter. Let's have at it. Or like, this is white. Let's add chalk to it, like for milk and stuff. But anyway, later that evening, a carpenter, Michael Ploschel, walked past the property. And he was blinded by a lantern light and remembers a fire burning in the oven. He remembers the person that was holding that lantern being a, quote, large man. 10 years after the crime, Michael said that he looked like Lorenz.
Yeah, that the figure.
So around 3:30 in the morning, Simon Rylander rode his bike after visiting his girlfriend in a nearby village. He passed the farmhouse on his way home, and he said that he noticed 2 young men on the property who seemed to be about 22 to 23 years old, and that one of them resembled Carl Bichler, the guy who had harassed the former maid with his brother, Anton. Then, on Sunday, April 2nd, 1922, one of Victoria's friends came to pick her up for church service. But when she got to the farm, she couldn't find anyone. And then the family didn't show up to church. A son of a farmer in Reichenbach wanted to buy lard from the farm, so he goes there, and he doesn't find anyone. Then, the next day, it's Monday, April 3rd, Joseph Mayer, the postman, reported that he had seen something different. But he doesn't report this until 1952. And what he says is that he put the newspaper on the kitchen window, as usual, and he noticed that he didn't see the pram in the kitchen, where it usually was. And if you don't know, a pram is like a baby stroller / carriage, so it's like an old-timey one. I think it's also like a European way of saying stroller, if I'm not mistaken. Like they still say pram. Some sources say that there was also mail piled up where he usually put it. Tuesday, April 4th, the next day, Albert Hoffner, a mechanic, arrived to the farm around 9 a.m. on his bicycle to repair a cylinder head gasket on the 4 HP diesel engine. I say as foreign as something could sound in my mouth, but some type of machinery, assuming
he was fixing things.
So before he got there, he had spoken with Mayor Gregor in Wangen for about a half hour, and he mentioned that he was on his way to the Hinterkaifeck farm. When he got there, the gate was locked, so he ran around the house to look for the residents. The back door was locked, so he looked through the kitchen and stable windows and saw no one. He remembered hearing a dog barking inside the house and cattle bellowing. He waited for about an hour before he broke into the engine shed and just started work. He had another repair scheduled for that day, and he was like, I have to start this so that I can get to my next job. And it took him about 4.5 hours to repair that engine.
And also I saw in one source that he had scheduled this fix either the week before or a few days before, but the weather just didn't allow for him to make it there. So, like, he was like, it's already been pushed back. I got to get this done.
I would also imagine that in a small area, you have typical people who you work with. He knew enough to know, like, where to look in and where to, like, quote unquote, break into. So he'd been there before. He knew that they're probably good for the money. They wanted him to fix it. It was an accident if they weren't answering the door.
Yeah.
It all makes sense to me as much as it could. Before Albert left, he whistled because he was hoping to get the attention of someone who was there, but nobody responded. And while he was working, he whistled, he sang, he tested the engine. All of these things are loud. So it's not as though it was a quiet endeavor. So before he left, he locked the door of the engine shed, and then he went through the garden into the yard. And that's when he noticed that the barn door was open. He walked up, but he didn't go in. He walked along the side of the house towards the front door, and there he found a dog tied up and barking, but the front door was locked. And I think that this is just a really good point for us to pause and repeat that layout of the house from earlier, because it's really easy to think barn, house, not so close to one another.
From some of the pictures that we could see and some diagrams, it looks like it had a living quarters, a stable, and a barn. But it seems like all of them were kind of under the same roof, but separated by walls and doors. And there was an attic upstairs, this is important to know, that was open, and it could be accessed by a ladder, either from the living quarters or from the barn.
All that to say is we're talking about one structure, so everything's very close.
Yeah, everything's close, and it is kind of an odd layout. So there is a document. It is in German, but just looking at the structure of the house, there's a lot of like things that connect in strange ways, in my opinion.
And we'll share this on our social media too. It'll be up by the time this episode comes out. So this way, if you wanted to take a peek at it, you could. It is basically like an L shape.
So Albert left around 2:30ish is his estimation. And now on his way, though, he ran into the neighbor's daughters, which were Lauren's and his new wife's daughters. I believe he became a stepdad when they married. And he told them that he just repaired the engine and no one was home, just chit-chat on his way out because he's riding his bike by. Now, Lauren sent Johann, his stepson, and Joseph to the farm to check. And Joseph is his son, not the baby, obviously, with his new wife. Now, two boys go to the farm, they check it out, they see no one, so they come home, they tell Lawrence, hey, no one's there. While they did this, Albert, who's also going to his next place, right? He ran into the mayor again.
The mayor is chatty.
And he told him, again, what he was up to. So he's like, I just fixed this engine. And I think he headed to his other appointment before heading home. While at the other appointment, though, on another farm in the area, he mentioned to them, I didn't see the Grubers while I was fixing the engine. That farmer said, well, I think he was talking about Andreas, but he mentioned that he usually goes into the forest to chop wood and usually didn't come home until after dark. So it's not unusual to not really run into anyone. So he took that and was like, okay, great. When Lauren's sons had returned, this was about 3:30, he was a little concerned. So he decided he was going to go check himself. Now, I don't know how he gathered them, if he went to the neighbors' homes or if the neighbors were just kind of around. But two neighbors also went, and that was Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. And then some sources vary. It says that the two stepsons or sons came, Johann and Joseph, but some sources don't. So unsure on that one. But anyways, they travel to Hinterkaifeck to see what's going on. So here's where we're going to kind of lay out the crime scene. When the group of neighbors arrived at the property, Lawrence, Michael, and Jacob entered the barn. They got in through the open door to the former engine house and forced open the barn door. So remember, everything's kind of connected in strange ways, so they had to go through another door to get into the larger part of it, from what I understand. When they did, that's when they found 4 bodies. The bodies were stacked on top of one another, but they were covered in hay. And from what we saw, it sounds like Lauren saw a foot sticking out, and he grabbed it and kind of tugged on it, and then discovered it was Andreas. Once that happened, he kind of noticed the other bodies, and he moved the body of Seeley, who was also in this pile of bodies. Because the position of the bodies was changed, the finders were asked to reconstruct the original situation. And from what I understand, that's what the crime scene photos are, is after they put them back.
As gruesome as that is, it does make sense. It's quite reasonable that you would have a visceral reaction to this crime scene, especially presumably he knew Seeley. And finding the body of a child that you know is going to be jarring. You're not going to think, I need to preserve this crime scene, especially in 1910 when people were traipsing about crime scenes. The fact that they even had them recreated is light years ahead of what I would expect, but I can't even imagine just the gut instinct to.
And he was a father as well. Everything kind of varies on where they were found, like how they're found, just the exact position, how they were stacked. Like, we saw so many different variations. I mean, it wasn't like they were in a whole different room or anything, but just little things were kind of changed here and there. But from what it sounded like, he moved Celie and kind of put her up against one of the machines. But the other two, so Victoria and Cecilia, may have been untouched, but some sources say they weren't, so I'm not sure.
We often do put photos about cases on our social media. As you can imagine, these will not be there.
No.
Because this is not something that somebody should accidentally stumble upon. Yeah. So if you do want to see them, you can Google them. They are available, but just know that we're not going to provide them.
Yeah, in a little bit, we're going to actually say a website that has a lot of case details. So we'll have that in our show notes too if you do want to see. But you will have to translate it as it is in German. Now, after this, it is said that Lawrence continued through the barn while the other two men went around through the courtyard to the front door. This fact is kind of changed here and there as well. Some say like he was in there for a little while alone. Some say he immediately went to the front door. I'm not sure. There, though, at the front door, Lawrence used a house key to open the front door and let everyone in. In the bedroom and in the maid's room, they then find two additional bodies, and that's little Joseph and the maid Maria. She was in her room, and then I believe Joseph was in either his bedroom or one of the bedrooms. After finding the bodies, Michael, Jacob, and possibly the boys if they were there, again, it doesn't really talk about them going in and seeing the bodies, so I'm not sure if they were even there. But anyways, they leave, and they leave Lawrence to wait for the authorities. Now, here's where it starts. Spectators begin viewing the crime scene shortly after. So they hear about it. Everyone has to come in and see what's going on and kind of mess up the crime scene.
Then on Wednesday, April 5th, the first witness statements are documented and crime scene photos are taken. Amanda just mentioned it, but the website that we would suggest taking a look at if you do want to look at those is hinterkaifeck.net. Again, you'll have to translate it. You can check our show notes. It'll be prominent in there so you can find it if you do want to go to it. There is talk of a crime scene sketch being done as well, but it wasn't released and it sounds like it was possibly lost. So everything is moving pretty rapidly in terms of our case suggestion. Like there's not a gap, if you will. So let's talk about how the bodies were found. Andreas was wearing a shirt and trousers, but his outfit was later referred to as sleepwear or underwear. Again, translations make this really difficult because how we describe lounge clothes, how we describe what we sleep in versus what we're getting dressed in, not only does it vary based on culture, but it varies based on time period. Andreas had significant skull injuries and a large open wound exposing his cheekbone. Again, we had mentioned before, but Lorenz had moved his body. Little Celie was barefoot and wearing a blue dotted shirt. Her body had also been moved and laid slightly against the wood chipper. She had severe head injuries, as well as a large gaping wound on her chin and one on her throat. She is believed to have survived the attack for at least a couple hours, and if she had been found, it's believed that she could have survived.
That breaks my heart.
Some sources say that she had pulled some of her own hair and still had it in her hands. Because again, she was little. She was just 7. Cecilia and Victoria's bodies were not moved, and the state file described them as, quote, the body of Cecilia Gruber lay directly under the threshold of this door, and Victoria Gabriel's body lay slightly perpendicular to it. And then the same report, it said that it was apparent that the way they were laying was a result of them having slumped down and then kind of like slowly gravity kind of pulled them into a laying position. Reports vary on who had the strangulation marks, but it's clear that at least one of the women had strangulation marks. Sources vary on whether both Victoria and Cecilia did have them, but most say that it was just one of them. Both Cecilia and Victoria were bludgeoned to death. Cecilia suffered 7 blows to the head and had a fractured skull, while Victoria had a shattered right side of her face, which was also caused by a blunt object. And Victoria had a fractured skull, as well as 9 star-shaped wounds on her head.
Yeah. And so when they were laying there, from what we saw, there was like a big board or door also, like kind of on top of it. So that's also why Andreas pulled the foot, because there was something large on top of it, and they're kind of buried in the hay. It's a very bizarre way to leave bodies.
Yes.
Now, Maria was not found in the barn. She was found in her bedroom or the maid's quarters, and she had severe skull fractures and trauma to her head. And from what we see in the photos too, it looks like someone had covered her, like put a blanket or something on her. Now, little Joseph was found in his bassinet, and he had a blow to the head as well. Also, I read in some sources that there was like a cover put over his bassinet, and it was like the usual one that you put over like when the baby's sleeping. And so whoever did this covered him after. But I didn't see it in every single one. And the crime scene photo looks like it's uncovered, but also things were disturbed. So let's chat about some of the additional details of the scene. There was a cow that was roaming freely in the barn, and the open barn door had blood splatters on it. The body, like I said before, was covered with something. It either was like a sawn off door, a board, something big, and then with hay. They found a pickaxe with reddish brown stains, and at first they were like, this must be the murder weapon. That's blood stains. But it was later ruled out because it just didn't match the wounds. The stable housed a bunch of different animals, and it was sectioned off into compartments. So I saw there was a decent amount of animals that lived there, so it must have been pretty big. Now, interestingly, the dog was found locked inside the barn. And that's usually what the family did with him every night. They'd put him in the barn at night, I believe, to probably like watch over the animals. He was described as a good and watchful dog. So he would bark when people would come. So I feel like if someone was near, they'd hear him barking. But then in some accounts, I saw that it was really hard to hear anything from the house into the barn because like they didn't want to hear those animal noises all the time. So I don't know if maybe the way it was situated, you just wouldn't hear as much. Not entirely sure.
It's also interesting because somebody said they saw that dog tied up out front.
Yes. Very interesting. So that day when they found him, the dog was distressed. He was aggressive. He didn't want anyone approaching him. He was very upset. Also, sadly, the poor baby, he had a severe blow to the head above his right eye. Now, you may be wondering, how did the dog go from being tied up out front, from when the mechanic saw him, to being in the barn? It's believed that the killer or killers may have stayed on the property for a few days. The animals on the property, so remember there's a ton of different animals, they were all milked and fed. New hay had been laid down, so they were taken care of. And I just want to note too, because, you know, this dog suffered abuse as well. He did end up in a new home, and it's documented, which I loved that they took the time to document that. So he was adopted by Jacob Gabriel, which was Carl's father. So remember Victoria's husband that passed away? It was his father. From what I saw, the Gabriels nursed him back to health and cared for him until his death. So he lived out a life with extended family. So let's go back to why we think people or a person may have stayed in this house after the murder. There had been fires during the night. Remember when someone walked by and they're like, oh, there's smoke coming out. There's also signs that the stove likely had been used, signs that meals would have been prepared after the estimated time of death. But oddly, the place wasn't ransacked. It wasn't really robbed that they could notice like anything big missing. It just seemed like someone lived there for a few days.
I don't like that.
No. And see, like Villisca was in town, right? So like whoever did that one had to leave by morning because they knew like people were going to look for them.
And there was a train station nearby. It didn't make sense, but it wasn't completely implausible that a stranger could come and do this because it wasn't out of the way.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. So then, on April 6th and 7th, the bodies were autopsied, and it was done by Dr. Johann Baptist Mueller. And he was the district court physician from Newburgh, and he did this on a makeshift table in the courtyard of the property. The record of the autopsies is not one of the documents that survived over the years, so we haven't seen any copies of it, and there are theories that this is one of the documents that was just lost in the war. On April 8th, the Grubers and Maria were buried in a common grave. Around 3,000 people attended the funeral. Most people didn't realize it at the time, but the bodies were buried without their heads. So the physician who did the autopsies removed the heads and shipped them to Munich for further examination. It's unknown what happened to them after, and they were lost in the subsequent bombings and the chaos of World War II. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to their heads.
That is incredibly wild.
Yeah. So to continue, we're going to move ahead a bit. We're going to June 7th of 1922. There was some dispute over who actually now owned the property. Was it the Gruber family or was it the Gabriel family? Bernard Gruber, Andreas's brother, lived on the property after the murders. The Gruber and the Gabriel families finally settled it out of court that the Gabriel family could purchase the property from the Grubers. And it seems like they just really wanted the land. Now, let's move forward again. We're going to February and March of 1923. Carl Gabriel Sr. and his sons, with the help of neighbors, demolished the property. Before the demolition, a mattock was found hidden in the attic of the farmhouse. Common practice of the time was to salvage as much material as possible, so it may have been found while they were trying to figure out how to preserve certain things in the home, but it seems like it was kind of tucked away. Interesting, though, to me that they didn't see that before, especially because there was so much talk of noises in the attic that no one truly, combed it over that thoroughly.
A lot of attics are a place where a lot of extra stuff is kept, and it would probably be very easy to hide items or yourself in a place that's filled with a lot of stuff, especially if, say things are covered with sheets. You're just hanging out.
Yeah, but I just feel like they didn't do a thorough job because also a penknife was found in the barn during the demolition in the hay. And the mattock that they found is believed to have actually been the murder weapon because it matches what could have done the blows to their heads, the pattern and everything.
So when you're thinking of Snow White and you're thinking of the tools that the dwarves are carrying, I'm pretty sure those are mattocks.
Yes.
It looks like what you think a pickaxe is, but that's actually a mattock. It's a really long stick, has a flat long side on one side, and the other side is a tiny hatchet.
Yeah, so they didn't find it until the demolition, which I thought was I feel like they could have done a better job here.
I agree.
So let's move on to the theories. The working theory is that whoever killed the family likely led them into the barn one by one before killing them. Many believe that Andreas died first because he was the biggest threat, and then the girls might have followed one by one, possibly because he didn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
It's unknown when Maria and Joseph were killed, but likely back to back that same night. I saw some estimations that it probably all happened within an hour. No one in the area heard any screams, nothing out of the ordinary that night. Nothing was reported that was different than usual. Now, there is so many theories and online arguments as to who did it. It's the biggest question that sparks so many online threads. We're going to cycle through a few, but there are so many, and we're going to focus on some of the bigger ones. When we wrote this outline, we had to cut ourselves off at 18 pages because we probably could have kept going for another 10.
Yeah. So the first suspect is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. And he's a suspect partially because he had a key and he discovered the body. Could this have been the missing key? He also knew the layout of the farmhouse, had prior financial disputes with the family, child support for a baby that maybe he didn't think was his. And some people think that it's a bit suspicious that he touched the body and that he, quote unquote, ruined the crime scene. Also, when we're thinking of motive, there's the dispute over, again, whether he's Joseph's father, the rejected marriage proposal, as well as his resentment towards Andreas. He was questioned a lot, but he was never charged. Well, there wasn't any physical evidence to tie to him, but also nowadays we know that looking back over 100 years, it's very likely that there probably was something somewhere on the property that would be evidence that we would consider physical evidence today. I don't think I could be convinced that the financial burden of a child that was not his would be enough to do all of this.
Right.
Unless he already wanted to murder someone. So he would need to be a person who was just already extremely violent for me to believe that he could murder 2 babies, 4 adults, and hurt a dog. That's all very bizarre. Not to mention the fact that whoever was there clearly was there for several days, and if he had his own family, that might seem a bit odd.
See, and on the flip side of that, a lot of people suspect him because he was so close. It would be super easy for him to go and float back and forth without, he could say, oh, I'm going to go work. I'm going to go work on the farm and then head over to theirs.
That one just doesn't sit well with me because it doesn't seem necessary. This was drawn out, and this seems like it was brutal in a way that was purposeful.
Yeah.
At least in my opinion. So another rumor is that there was a farmhand that may have left angrily at some point. And this makes sense because again, from all those accounts we saw, Andreas was kind of a dick. And chances are they were mad at him. And there may have been, again, another payment dispute. There weren't any documented farmhands that we could find that were ever a suspect. But the theory can make some sense, especially because the animals were cared for and the person clearly knew the layout. If you were a person who was doing it because of a payment dispute and you cared about those animals, you may have just taken some of them. Animals are considered property and they're sellable, and not all of them are incredibly recognizable, especially if you go like a couple towns over or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, here is another theory. And some people think that it was Carl Gabriel. And remember, we mentioned Carl in the beginning. He was Victoria's husband, who was said to have died in World War I. And some people think that he didn't die and he returned to the farm to see what Andreas was doing to Victoria, and he killed everyone out of rage. However, this seems strange to us because why would he murder his child? Also, his unit was questioned about his death after the murders, and they confirmed he was killed in a shell attack, although his body was never found.
So, another theory is that, just like Villisca, it was a random person, a drifter, someone passing through, something like that. Or someone that was passing through that had been living in the attic for some time. Now, the theory believes that this person, individual or persons, we don't know, came across the home and decided to stay in the attic unnoticed for a bit. Perhaps that's what they were hearing, is the person coming and going or walking around. The theory, though, says that this person or persons murdered the family in order to rob them. But again, nothing big was taken. They did have a sum of money, from what I understand, but it didn't seem disturbed or like a big significant thing would have been taken from this home, because they did find money, they found valuables, they found everything still within the home.
But you never quite know what people have. And if everyone who would know the entire contents of the house isn't around, then how would you know?
Another theory is that perhaps it was a family member. Remember how we brought up that there was a dispute over the property after their deaths? Some suggest that it may have been a family member wanting to take over the farm and land. The farm did bring in good money at the time. It had animals, it provided food, the family owned the land outright. There's also another reason why some believe that the animals were cared for, because the animals were living assets to the farm.
Yeah.
We couldn't find any particular family member that ever was a suspect. Again, a lot of the documents are lost. But it is interesting that there was a big dispute after. And that especially Andreas's brother kind of moved in. I couldn't find a date that he moved in, if it was directly after, if it was after some time to keep the farm going. Another theory that we did see is that Andreas did it and that he killed his family and then someone stumbled upon it and then got revenge and killed him.
That really tracks to me, because he does seem like a person who was eventually going to snap at some point. You don't rape your daughter for years, isolate her, control her, and then just stop there. I don't think it's bizarre to think that he may have escalated.
I have some belief that that could happen, but then also some questions. And it's if, let's say, someone heard what was happening, right? So the barn kind of happened, Andreas is still alive. If they were to then kill Andreas, who killed the people inside? The two inside? Or did he kill them and kill the two inside and then was found?
I know that the belief is that Andreas died first. Of all the theories we've talked about, I think that it makes the most sense that someone would happen upon Andreas after the fact and that they would kill him. And that everyone around went, yeah, good. The world was a better place for not having Andreas in it. It is a very personal thing to strangle someone. You have to look at someone in the face while you do that. And it is interesting that the people who could have been strangled were Victoria and Cecilia. Were likely that his largest victims their entire lives. So the fact that their injuries appear to be so much worse suggests to me that it was him.
Yeah, agreed.
In some of the sources we saw, it seemed as though there were suggestions that Victoria wasn't completely unwilling. And when you're thinking about consent, one of the things that is really important is to think about a power dynamic. Even if Victoria was an adult, given the fact that that was her father, and given the fact that the sexual abuse began years before she was of the age of consent, even take out their relationship. If you start having a sexual relationship with a child and you continue it on through adulthood, it is not morally okay because they're an adult who can consent, because you have been grooming them from that period. And when right now there is a lot in the world around the sexual assault of minors, I think that it is so important to say that if you take the consent away from a child and then it's given as an adult, I don't think that that's real and true consent, because that person has been groomed and made to believe and made to think a certain way. And I don't think that it's really true consent, which is the same reason that I find it problematic that if you're friends with someone as an adult who's like 10 and you know them your whole life, and suddenly at 18 you're like, hey, let's have a relationship, I think that's fucking gross.
It is. It is. Another theory as to like perhaps Andreas did it that we did see is that maybe he was kind of like a family annihilator, right? He just snapped, finally killed them all.
Yeah.
And perhaps he killed himself.
Yeah.
Some accounts say that the blow was different on his head versus the others. And so maybe the way that the thing was held or something along those lines. Again, a lot of the documents are gone, so it's hard to say for sure exactly, you know, like the autopsy report. We could see the images of how they looked, but again, it's black and white and kind of fuzzy too. Another idea too, just to put out there, is at this time, the mattock was used for a variety of things on a farm. One theory, and I can't really find for surezies if he did this, but one theory is that when you had pigs on a farm, a mattock was used to slaughter them. And so if Andreas did that often, he'd be pretty good with a mattock and pretty good about hitting someone or something the correct way, you know, like to knock them out or to kill them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
So that is a thought as well. But again, it's like, did someone walk in? Did he kill himself? That is interesting. Or there's other farms in the area though. So like other people in this area could be pretty well versed in using it.
Yeah, they would have that same skill set.
And then, of course, because we have to, some believe that it was something supernatural. And some lean into the idea that the original maid quitting was for surezies due to paranormal events. And they believe that it was not someone, but rather something, some sort of entity that was in the attic waiting for the right moment to take the lives of the family and the maid. They also speculate that that was the reason that their heads were removed, because certain beliefs were if you remove the head from the body, it stops restless spirits. And then also like some think that's why it was torn down too, like to prevent further happenings.
Interesting. Yeah, I just feel more like there's some things that you just get rid of.
But again, this is just a sample of how many theories there are as to who did it and why. We had to cut it down or we'd be going on forever.
And in 2017, 15 police academy students examined the case using some modern investigation techniques. And in their final report, they said that they had a main suspect, but it was never revealed to the public because of their descendants. And so for that reason, some people think that it may have been Lorenz, because that rules out some people. Andreas, for example, wouldn't have other descendants. So it would have to be somebody who did have descendants. Today, there is a memorial on the grounds at Hinterkaifeck Farms. There have been several documentaries, books, and the case has even been featured on many TV shows. And there's even a movie based off of the events called Hinterkaifeck. This was a really interesting case to research, especially like going down all the rabbit holes. And we are, as always, curious as to what you think. So take a peek at our social media if you haven't already. If you're interested, you can see some more of the documentation about the property and such at hinterkaifeck.net, also in our show notes. But we'd love to hear from you. So head on over to the Bat Bonfire to continue chatting about this with us.
Yeah. And do you have any other theories? Because we went through a lot of Reddit threads too, and you can see them because we have them in our sources. But this is just like Villisca. There is so many theories. And as you read a lot of them, you're like, yeah, I see it. Like, I see why that one could be true. And then you read the next and you're like, oh yeah, that one too.
Yeah.
It's wild because there's so many things at play. And we got to remember too, the scene was disturbed. There was a lot of people that knew the farm, knew the people, knew the layout.
Yeah.
It was isolated, so it would be easy to kind of go in and out without being noticed. And then also, when did that person came to the farm? Was it that night where there was the footsteps in the snow? Were they already there? Was that their first time there? There's just so many questions and different things that you can think about. And then just like all the people trampling the evidence and moving shit around. And basically there could have been something else that got moved or taken, because we know that a lot of people love taking things from crime scenes. So
yeah, there could have been things that made more sense.
Just interesting thoughts. Yeah, for sure. We want to hear your theories. Please go to the Bat Bonfire. If you're in our Discord, we want to hear what you think. Had you heard about this case before? What was your favorite theory? Or what do you think?
Yes. And with that, have a great weekend.
Thanks for creeping with us.
Thanks for listening. And as always, a special thank you to our patrons who support us via Patreon.
Please see the link in our show notes to learn more about how you, yes you, can begin to haunt the dump, guard vortexes, or even become a scorching Sasquatch.
Ooh. Also in our show notes, you can find the link to our website, more information on our sources, our social media handles, and our merch store.
We'd love for you to keep creeping with us. So if you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the show with your fellow creeps and or ghosts.
I beg of you.